The second Stephen Miller opened his mouth, you could feel the temperature drop 10 degrees in the hearing room. He sat there in a charcoal suit, one hand wrapped around a pen he clearly had no intention of using. His voice came out smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who'd made a career out of turning fear into policy. "We'll deport them all," he said, with that faint smile that never reached his eyes. "Every last undocumented migrant who believes they have a claim to our country." Cameras clicked. A few staffers in the back exchanged glances. Some looked like they wanted to applaud. Others looked embarrassed to even be breathing the same air. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She just leaned back in her chair, arms folded across the navy fabric of her blazer, watching him like she'd been waiting for this moment longer than he'd been alive. He kept talking, numbers, sound bites, clipped sentences that made human lives sound like inventory to be cleared out. "And if you think compassion is an excuse for lawlessness," Stephen said, "then you're part of the problem." That was the line that made Jasmine smile, not wide, not warm, but the kind of smile that comes right before something unmovable snaps. Reporters started to lean forward, as if they could sense it too. This wasn't going to be one of those polite, tepid exchanges that dies in a news cycle. This was about to be a reckoning. She uncrossed her arms, placed her palms flat on the table, and fixed her gaze on Stephen so completely that even he seemed to hesitate. The room went still, no coughing, no shuffling, not even the soft tapping of phones. Just silence, stretching longer than most people could stand. And in that silence, you could feel it, the shift. The moment a man with all the power in the world realized he'd finally said something so ugly that not even the walls could pretend not to hear. "Mr. Miller," Jasmine began, her voice low but resonant, "I want to be absolutely clear. You're telling the American people you'll hunt down millions of families, people who cook your food, clean your hotels, build your roads, and you expect them to just accept it?" He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "They broke the law, Congresswoman. Actions have consequences." She nodded slowly. "They do. And so do words." A hush fell over the committee. You could almost hear the collective realization that she wasn't going to let this slide into another forgettable policy debate. Jasmine reached into her folder and pulled out a single photograph, creased, black and white, edges worn thin from years of being carried around. She held it up so the cameras could see. "This," she said, voice steady, "is my grandmother. She came here in 1947 with nothing but a suitcase and a promise she believed America had made to her, that if she worked hard enough, she could belong." Stephen didn't move. "You think you're strong because you can sign a piece of paper that tries to erase people like her from the story," Jasmine continued, her tone sharpening like a blade. "But the truth is, you're terrified that no matter how many walls you build, you can't stop the fact that this country was never yours to hoard." He blinked, and in that flicker of uncertainty, the whole room seemed to lean toward Jasmine. Toward the story she was unspooling like a fuse. "Your policies," she said, tapping the photo once for emphasis, "aren't about law. They're about fear. About making sure that immigrants remain just scared enough to be silent and just tired enough to be invisible." The gallery was silent. Even the aides who usually looked at their phones were frozen, eyes locked on her. Stephen cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. But he didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Because Jasmine wasn't just speaking to him anymore. She was speaking to every family watching, every child who'd ever been told they didn't belong, every worker who'd ever been called an invader. And she was just getting started. Stephen's jaw tightened, but he tried to look unbothered. "Respectfully, Congresswoman," he said, "I don't need lectures about American history. I know exactly what this nation stands for." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, like she was studying a specimen under glass. "That's the problem," she replied calmly. "You think you know." A ripple of uneasy laughter from the gallery. She didn't wait for it to die down before she continued. "My grandmother worked in a textile mill," she said, holding the photograph steady. 12-hour shifts. No health insurance. No voice. And still, she believed in the promise of this country, because no one had told her yet that men like you would spend their entire careers trying to rewrite it. Stephen started to respond, but Jasmine kept going, voice rising just enough to reach every corner of the room. You talk about law and order as if you invented the concept, she said. But the law isn't your inheritance to dole out as you please. The law is a covenant, a promise that this country will belong to everyone willing to work for it. And you want to break that promise, just to feel powerful. Somewhere in the back, a reporter's hand was trembling as they typed, trying to capture every word before it disappeared. You think deporting millions of people will make you strong, Jasmine said, leaning forward, her palms pressing into the table. It won't. It just proves what everyone already suspects, that your vision for America is so small, so scared, that you have to bully the powerless to feel important. Stephen's lips parted. For a moment, he looked like he might fire back. But no words came. Because Jasmine hadn't left him any safe ground to stand on. She reached into her folder again and pulled out a thin stack of papers, affidavits, letters, court records. You know what these are? She asked, her voice soft but carrying. Testimonies. From families you would call criminals. Stories of mothers who worked double shifts so their kids could go to college. Of fathers who cleaned your offices at midnight and still got up at 5 a.m. to build your subdivisions. She slid them across the table. I want you to look at them, she said. And then tell me again that all you see is illegals. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air had turned solid. Even Stephen's aides shifted uncomfortably. And for the first time since he sat down, Stephen Miller didn't have a single thing to say. Jasmine leaned back slowly, folding her hands in front of her. For a beat, she simply looked at Stephen, letting the silence become its own indictment. You could see the discomfort crawling across his face, the way his jaw flexed as if he was chewing on a retort he knew would sound hollow. You see, Mr. Miller, she continued, her tone low and steady, it's easy to play tough when you're in front of cameras. It's easy to call entire communities criminals when you'll never have to look them in the eye. She picked up one of the affidavits and began reading, her voice clear enough that the gallery fell absolutely still. My son was born here. He loves baseball. He wants to be a firefighter. When the ICE officers came at 4 a.m., he was holding his stuffed bear. He kept asking why we were being taken. Jasmine set the paper down and locked eyes with Stephen. You think you're the hero in this story. You think you're protecting America. But what you're really protecting is a lie, that belonging is something you can ration out, like bread in a famine. Someone in the press pool wiped at their eyes and pretended it was allergies. Stephen drew in a slow breath, trying to reclaim his footing. Representative Crockett, you're very good at theater, he said, voice clipped. But the law is the law. And illegal entry has consequences. It's not about feelings. Jasmine's face didn't flicker. She didn't glance at her notes. She didn't look at the cameras. It's never been about feelings, she said quietly. It's about decency. About remembering that people are not props in your ambition. Her voice grew stronger, word by word. You stand here in your tailored suit and call yourself a patriot, but real patriots build a country big enough for everyone's dreams, not just their own comfort. The gallery burst into a low murmur. Stephen's knuckles whitened where they gripped the table's edge. Jasmine leaned in just enough that he couldn't look away. And if you think I'm going to sit here and let you diminish everything my ancestors survived so you can posture for headlines, she paused, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried farther than any shout. You've underestimated me. There it was, the quiet force that cracked the room open. And Stephen Miller, architect of deportations and bans, looked for the first time like a man who realized he was cornered not by policy, but by truth. Stephen Miller tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He reached for his glass of water, and even that small gesture looked unsteady. The camera zoomed in, capturing the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way he struggled to reset his expression into something smug. But the room was no longer on his side. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply reached for the second affidavit and held it up for everyone to see. This is from a U.S. citizen whose husband was deported because of a clerical error. He spent 14 months in detention before anyone admitted the mistake. She tapped the page with her fingertip, her voice crisp but almost sad. 14 months. Do you know what he missed? His daughter's first steps. His son's graduation. His father's funeral. The hearing room went silent except for the distant hum of an air vent. Stephen swallowed again, fighting for composure. "You're cherry-picking anecdotes," he said finally, his tone clipped but thinner now. "You can always find a sob story to distract from." Jasmine held up her palm to stop him, not harsh, just final. "You call them sob stories," she said, her eyes fixed on his. "I call them America." Her voice lowered, every syllable deliberate. "You built your career on the idea that cruelty makes you strong. That fear makes you righteous. But all it's really made you is small." Stephen's mouth opened, then closed. He looked around for backup, maybe from a sympathetic representative, maybe from the cameras. None came. Jasmine didn't rush the moment. She let it settle, like dust in a shaft of sunlight. "When you're gone from this place," she continued, softer now, "no one is going to remember the talking points you repeated. No one will care about the slogans you printed. They'll remember the families you broke, the children you terrified, the faith you betrayed." And then she said the line that would be replayed across every network, quoted in 1,000 comment sections. "History doesn't forget who closed the door. And it sure as hell doesn't forgive them." Stephen stared back at her, but there was nothing left to say. The panel chair cleared his throat, trying to reclaim the room. "Thank you, Representative Crockett. Mr. Miller, do you wish to respond?" Stephen Miller looked down at his notes, pages of pre-written remarks, statistics he thought would shield him. But none of them felt usable now. His hands hovered over the paper like he'd forgotten why he'd picked it up in the first place. He tried anyway. "America has the right to enforce its borders," he said, but even he sounded like he didn't believe the words anymore. "We cannot sustain uncontrolled migration without sacrificing." Jasmine leaned in, and the microphones caught the quiet gravity in her voice. "No one's asking you to erase the border," she said. "We're asking you to remember the humanity on the other side of it." A murmur rippled through the gallery, journalists shifting forward in their chairs, staffers exchanging glances. The impact was immediate. Stephen swallowed, his eyes flicking to the cameras again. But they weren't offering him an escape. If anything, they were capturing every second of his unraveling. Jasmine continued, her voice gaining strength without rising. "You talk about sustaining America," she said. "But you forget what sustains it. The labor. The sacrifice. The courage of immigrants who came here with nothing but hope, and who built something you'll never understand because you've never needed to." Stephen tried to interrupt, with respect, "That's a gross." But she didn't let him finish. "My grandfather was one of them," she said, her tone sharpening. "He worked 18-hour shifts laying asphalt, so his kids could have a chance. Your policies would have told him to go back where he came from. My family wouldn't be here if people like you had their way." The gallery fell so still that every breath seemed too loud. "And let me tell you something, Mr. Miller," Jasmine added, leaning in until her words felt impossible to dodge. "He was more American than you will ever be." A sharp exhale came from someone behind the press riser. No one dared move. Stephen pressed his lips together, blinking fast. For the first time all morning, he didn't have a comeback. Jasmine didn't look away. She let the truth hang there, bare and unvarnished. And across the country, millions of people were watching, some cheering, some furious, but all unable to look away. For a moment, it seemed Stephen Miller might stand up and leave, just gather his notes and walk out. But something in the stillness pinned him in his chair. Maybe it was the cameras. Maybe it was Jasmine's gaze, level and unblinking. He cleared his throat. "I respect your family's story," he began, voice tight. "But immigration policy isn't about sentiment, it's about the rule of law." Jasmine's eyes flickered, and she tilted her head slightly, as if studying a specimen under glass. "Law without empathy is tyranny," she said evenly. "And you can wrap your agenda in as many legal citations as you want, but it doesn't make it moral." A staffer behind Stephen shifted uncomfortably. Another picked up her phone and began typing so fast her fingers blurred. The hearing had slipped out of anyone's control, and everyone knew it. Stephen tried to pivot. "The American people are tired," Jasmine cut in, voice suddenly softer, which only made it hit harder. "Tired of politicians who build their careers demonizing the people doing the work most of us won't. Tired of you pointing a finger at those with the least power to distract from the fact that you've never built anything yourself." He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. "My grandfather never took a dime he didn't earn," she went on, her tone still calm but edged like glass. "He didn't sit behind a microphone telling families they didn't belong. He didn't invent monsters to stay relevant." The chair tried again to interject. "Representative." But Jasmine didn't stop. Her eyes locked on Stephen's. "You don't get to call yourself a patriot while treating human life as disposable. That's not patriotism. That's cowardice dressed up in a flag." Silence. Heavy and total. Somewhere in the back, a reporter whispered, "Jesus." Stephen swallowed, his jaw tightening. But he didn't move. Because everyone knew, this wasn't a debate anymore. It was an unmasking. And millions of Americans were watching, some with tears in their eyes, some with their hands clenched in fury, but all of them finally hearing something real. Stephen Miller hadn't spoken in over a minute. For a man who'd built his reputation on relentless messaging, it was almost surreal. He looked down at the table, jaw working, but no retort came. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, let it become the kind of moment that pressed into people's memory whether they liked it or not. Finally, she drew a steady breath. "Let me be clear," she said. "This country has never been perfect. But it has always been at its strongest when we decide that dignity is not negotiable." A woman behind the press table lifted her phone to record. Another reporter slowly set aside his notepad, eyes fixed on Jasmine as if he, too, needed to see whether Stephen would look her in the eye. "I'm not going to sit here," Jasmine continued, "while you pretend this is just about policy disagreements. It's not. It's about fear." Stephen shifted in his chair, his gaze flicking up, defensive, brittle. "You are afraid," she said calmly, "that if you admit immigrants are human beings deserving of respect, you'll have to face what your career has cost. You're afraid you'll have to answer for the suffering your words have sanctioned. And you should be." A ripple moved through the room. Some staffers averted their eyes. Others looked straight at Stephen, no longer sure whether to shield him or distance themselves. He cleared his throat. "Representative Crockett." "No," she said, her voice suddenly cutting. "You don't get to pivot. Not here. Not when families are still separated because of the policies you championed. Not when children are still sleeping on concrete because you decided their parents were the threat." His mouth tightened, but he didn't interrupt again. Jasmine let her hand rest on the folder of case files in front of her. "This isn't about my grandfather's story," she said softly. "It's about all the stories you've erased because they made your narrative inconvenient." The quiet was electric. Even those who disagreed with her sat motionless, caught in the gravity of what she refused to let be dismissed. Outside, the clip was already making its way across 100 screens, thousands of feeds. But inside, the hearing room felt suspended, like the whole country was holding its breath to see whether Stephen would finally acknowledge the human cost. He didn't. And that, more than any outburst, said everything. Jasmine Crockett didn't have to shout to make her point. She didn't even have to lean forward. She just kept her voice low, measured, and somehow that restraint cut deeper than any outburst. Stephen Miller swallowed, eyes darting to the committee chair for reprieve. None came. Everyone was watching. "You know what's worse than cruelty?" Jasmine asked, tapping her fingertip lightly against the stack of affidavits she'd brought. "Cowardice dressed up as patriotism." Stephen's jaw flexed again. He didn't deny it. He didn't do much of anything except breathe, tight, shallow. "My office," Jasmine went on, "gets letters every week from families who believed what you promised. That if they just waited in line, played by the rules, respected the process, they'd be allowed to belong." She flipped the top page over, revealing a photo of a father and daughter standing behind a chain-link fence, eyes wide and hollow. "Then you changed the process. You moved the line. You moved it again. And again." Stephen exhaled, slow, defensive. "The law is clear." "No," she interrupted, her voice rising just enough to cut through his script. "The law is written by people. And sometimes people decide their fear matters more than the truth." The press table was stone still. One of the older reporters mouthed, "Wow," to nobody in particular. Stephen tried again. "What you call fear is exactly that," she finished for him. "Fear that if you let these families in, you'll have to confront your own narrative. That you'll have to accept America isn't just the parts you approve of." She held his gaze, unblinking. The camera zoomed in, just close enough to catch the tightness in his throat. "I am not here to let you rewrite what happened," Jasmine said, voice dropping to a near whisper. "I am here to remind you that you don't get to hide behind procedure when the cost has a name." Stephen Miller didn't answer. The silence was thick, almost tactile. You could feel it in your bones. And for a moment, it wasn't about left or right, immigrant or citizen, blue tie or red. It was about whether a single person sitting at that table would look at the human cost of their ambitions and feel anything. Jasmine leaned back, the photograph still visible on the table. She didn't have to say it out loud, he never would. The last words didn't need volume. They needed precision. Jasmine Crockett let the hush in the room expand until it seemed almost alive. Every camera was fixed on her face, every spectator leaning forward, as if they knew, somehow, that this was the part people would replay again and again. "I'm tired," she began, voice deceptively gentle, "of hearing you say this is about safety. About jobs. About resources." Stephen Miller's mouth opened, but she raised her palm, stopping him without a word. "Because what it's really about," she continued, "is the fear that you will be outnumbered. That someone who doesn't look like you, pray like you, love like you, might one day have the same power you do." She tapped the photo of the father and daughter again. "And you call that fear patriotism?" Stephen tried to sit taller, to collect the scraps of composure left to him. But it didn't matter. Nothing he said could erase the picture Jasmine had painted, of policy as a weapon, of families reduced to leverage. "You think America is something you can hoard," she said softly. "But it isn't yours to ration. It never was." She exhaled, slow and steady. It felt like the entire hearing was holding its breath. Stephen's eyes flicked around the room, looking for a sympathetic face. None met his. "You wanted history to remember you as the man who protected America," Jasmine said. "It will remember you as the man who tried to shrink it." The final sentence didn't rise above a conversational tone, but it landed like a gavel. No applause followed. Just the whir of camera shutters and the unshakable certainty that everyone had just witnessed a reckoning. Jasmine gathered her papers. She didn't smile. She didn't look triumphant. She just looked tired, and honest, and unafraid. And in that stillness, with the whole country watching, it was clear who had already won. In the end, it wasn't the volume of Jasmine's voice that made the world stop and listen. It was the quiet certainty that she would not flinch, no matter how many times Stephen Miller invoked fear, no matter how many walls he tried to build around his vision of America. What happened in that room was more than a clash of ideologies. It was a reminder that real patriotism isn't about exclusion. That the truest form of strength is telling the truth, even when it costs you comfort. And that no policy, no slogan, no manufactured panic can erase the humanity of the people it targets. As Jasmine walked out of the hearing, cameras trailing behind her, there was no victory speech. There didn't need to be. Because the point had already been made. Loud enough to echo far beyond those walls. America is not yours to ration. It never was. If this story resonated with you, share it. Because sometimes, the most powerful change begins with refusing to stay silent.